She was 16 years old, barefoot in February, and the snow was already up to her knees. That is the fact at the center of this story. The hard, irreducible fact that everything else must be measured against. Not the betrayal that came before it, not the miracle that came after, not the years of silence that stretched between those 2 points like a frozen river nobody dared to cross. Just a girl, barefoot, February, snow to her knees. And behind her, growing smaller in the darkness, the headlights of her father's truck as he drove away. She didn't know in that moment that she would survive. She had no particular reason to believe she would. She had no shoes, no coat, $3 in the pocket of her jeans, and a body already shaking so hard her teeth were cutting the inside of her lip. She didn't know that the cabin she would crawl toward, the one she could just barely see through the pines, a single amber light burning in a single window, shouldn't have been there. The land had been empty for 11 years. Everyone in Harlan County knew that. The records said it. The county maps said it. There was nothing out there on the backside of Craddock Ridge except timber and rock and the bones of a family that had given up on that place a decade before she was born. But the light was there, and she was out of choices. What she found inside that cabin changed the rest of her life. What she found inside that cabin, and the woman who lived in it, and the story that woman carried in her hands like something too fragile to set down. All of it rewrote everything Nora Gaines thought she understood about where she came from, who had abandoned her, and what, if anything, was worth going back for. This is Nora's story. It begins not in the snow, but in the years before the snow, in a house that smelled like cornbread and wood smoke, in a town where everybody knew your name and about half of them meant well by it, in a childhood that was imperfect and warm and entirely hers. It begins the way all the most devastating stories begin, with someone who had something, with someone who didn't yet know what it meant to lose. Harlan County, Kentucky sits in the southeastern corner of the state, like something the rest of the world forgot to come back for. The mountains there are old, older than the Appalachians in any meaningful human sense. Old in the way that makes you feel small and provisional when you drive through them, like the land is tolerating your presence rather than welcoming it. The coal that made the county famous had already begun its long decline by the time Nora Gaines was born in the spring of 1987, but the culture it had built, the particular combination of stubbornness, pride, close kinship, and bone-deep suspicion of anything from outside the ridge, that was still entirely intact, possibly more intact for the decline. Yes, communities under pressure have a way of calcifying around what they know. Nora was the second of 3 children born to Gerald and Patricia Gaines. Gerald worked maintenance for the county school system, a steady job, not glamorous, the kind of work that keeps the world running invisibly. Patricia cleaned houses 3 days a week and grew a kitchen garden that was the envy of everyone on their road. The Gaines family was not wealthy. They were not poor in the way that leaves marks. They were the kind of working people who existed in the careful middle space. Enough, always just enough, with enough love layered over the top that the edges of not enough didn't cut. Nora was the kind of child who is hard to describe without resorting to cliches that don't quite fit. She was not a tomboy exactly, though she spent more time in the woods behind their house than any of her siblings. She was not a bookworm exactly, though she read voraciously, anything she could get from the school library, which wasn't much, and anything her 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Cawood, passed her under the desk, with the quiet understanding that this particular child needed more than the curriculum could provide. She was curious in the way that some children are curious, not about facts, but about how things fit together, about why people did what they did, about the gap between what people said and what they meant. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's jaw, square and a little stubborn, and a laugh that her brother Danny said sounded like a screen door in a windstorm, which was not a compliment and was also not entirely wrong. She had a habit of going still when something troubled her, the way a deer goes still, her whole body becoming a listening instrument. People who didn't know her well thought this meant she was shy. People who did know her understood it meant she was paying very close attention. The house they lived in was a 2-story frame house on Cutters Creek Road, 3 miles from the nearest stoplight, painted white with green shutters that Gerald repainted every other spring. The porch wrapped around 2 sides and held in the summer Patricia's collection of hanging baskets, petunias, sweet potato vine, One stubborn fern that somehow survived being brought inside every winter for 9 consecutive years. There was a tire swing in the yard that Danny had once flown off of in a way that required 4 stitches and a lesson about physics that none of the Gaines children ever forgot. There was a dog named Biscuit who was extremely old and extremely deaf and slept on the porch in a patch of afternoon sun with the satisfaction of someone who had earned it. This is the world Nora came from. Hold it in your mind. The green shutters, the fern, old Biscuit in the sun. Hold it, because this is the thing that will be taken from her, and you need to know what it felt like when it was intact. The trouble began, as trouble so often begins in communities like Harlan County, with a boy. His name was Cody Whitaker, and he was 18 years old to Nora's 15 when they met at a school dance in October of 2002. He was, by any honest accounting, beautiful in the way that certain young men are beautiful before the world has finished working on them. Tall, dark-haired, with the easy physical confidence of someone who had always been looked at appreciatively and had never had a reason to be anything other than comfortable in his own body. He played second-string football, not because he wasn't good enough for first string, but because he missed too many practices, a detail that nobody paid particular attention to at the time, but that said something true about him. He had a truck, a 2000 Silverado with a broken tailgate and a sound system that was worth more than everything else about the truck combined. He smiled at Nora across the gymnasium in a way that made her stomach do something it had never done before, and that was the beginning of the end of everything she had. She was not stupid. That is crucial to understand. Nora Gaines was not a naive girl who was manipulated by a charming boy. Or rather, she was only that in the way that all 15-year-olds are susceptible to charm, in the way that all of us are, at 15, operating on a brain that is not yet fully capable of calculating consequences over long-time horizons. She was smart, and she was careful in many ways, and she still ended up where she ended up. Because the cruelty of that age is not that it targets the foolish, it targets everyone. They were together for 8 months. Nora kept it quiet at home for the first 2, not because she was ashamed of Cody, but because she knew her father had opinions about boys with trucks and sound systems, and she was not ready to have that conversation. By the time she introduced Cody to her parents, on a Sunday afternoon in December that was cold and sharp and smelled like wood smoke and the particular clarity of Appalachian winter, she had already understood several things about him. That he was not as easy inside himself as he appeared, that he had a mother who cried in the kitchen, and a father who was not kind, and that he came to Nora the way some people come to someone generous, not to give, but to be replenished. She understood all of this, and she loved him anyway, because she was 15, and because love at 15 is not diminished by being young. It is only unprotected. Gerald Gaines shook Cody Whitaker's hand and looked at him for exactly the length of time it takes to size up a boy who is looking at your daughter. He didn't say much at the table that afternoon. He passed the biscuits and asked Cody questions about school and nodded at the answers. After Cody left, he sat on the porch with his coffee and said nothing at all. Patricia told Nora later, in the quiet of the kitchen, that her father had decided to give Cody Whitaker the benefit of the doubt. Nora understood what her mother wasn't saying, that the benefit of the doubt was not infinite, that her father was watching. By March, Nora knew something was wrong with her body. She was 16 years and 1 month old, and she had taken 3 pregnancy tests bought with money saved from babysitting the Hendersons' 2 kids on Friday nights, each one purchased at a different drugstore in a different town, because she was smart enough to understand that drugstore purchases in small counties are not private. All 3 tests said the same thing. She sat on the floor of the bathroom at school, tests wrapped in paper towels and stuffed into her backpack, and she went completely still in the way that she went still when something troubled her. Her whole body a listening instrument, listening for something. She wasn't sure what. Some sign of what to do next. She told Cody on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the Dairy Queen on Cumberland Avenue. She told him in a flat, careful voice that she had practiced, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she didn't trust herself not to fall apart if she didn't hold on to the words tightly. She said, "I'm pregnant. I'm keeping it. I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm just telling you because you deserve to know." Cody stared through the windshield for a long time. He was quiet in the way that she recognized now as different from her own stillness. Not a listening quiet, but a calculating one. He said he needed time to think. She said okay. He drove her home. He didn't call that night or the next night or the night after that. When she saw him in the hallway at school, he looked at the floor and redirected his path before they could make eye contact. By the end of the week, she understood that Cody Whitaker had made his decision, and that the decision was that he would be pretending none of this was happening. It was the first time in her life that someone had simply chosen not to see her. It would not be the last. She told her mother on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table before church, because she couldn't find another moment that felt right, and she was running out of Sundays. Patricia Gaines went very still in a way that reminded Nora of herself, and then she reached across the table and put her hand over Nora's, and she said, Okay, let me think." The word she kept using was okay, and Nora understood it not as reassurance, but as a kind of anchoring, her mother holding herself in place against the force of the information. They sat like that for several minutes. Outside, Biscuit barked once at something in the yard, then was quiet. Patricia told Gerald that evening. Nora knew by the silence that fell over the upstairs hallway, by the drop in the temperature of the house that had nothing to do with the thermostat. She lay in her bed and listened to the low, controlled sound of her parents' voices through the wall, her mother's rising once, sharp, and then quieting. Her father's never rising at all. That was what frightened her. Gerald Gaines was not a man who raised his voice when he was most angry. He got quieter. He came to her room at 10 o'clock, when the rest of the house was dark. He stood in the doorway, and she sat up in bed and looked at him, and what she saw on his face was something she had never seen there before and didn't have a name for yet. She was only 16, and she hadn't yet learned that particular combination of emotions, shame and rage and grief and pride, all wound together so tightly they were indistinguishable. She would spend years later learning to recognize it. It was the face of a person who had decided. He said, "You're not keeping it." She said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Not under my roof." She said, "It's my body and it's my baby and I'm keeping it." There was a silence that lasted. She counted afterward, in the way that you count things when you're trying to hold on to the exact shape of a moment before it becomes memory. 7 seconds. Then Gerald Gaines said, "Then you're not under my roof either." And he closed the door. She heard her mother's voice in the hallway, low and urgent, and then silence, and then nothing. Nobody opened the door again. She got dressed in the dark. She put on jeans and a flannel shirt and the hoodie she wore to school. She packed a backpack, clothes, the $43 in cash she'd been saving, the photograph of her mother and her that sat on her dresser, taken 2 Christmases ago when the tree lights had blurred behind them into something that looked almost magical. She didn't take her winter coat. She didn't take her shoes. She didn't take her shoes because she was not thinking clearly, because she was 16 years old, and she had just been told by her father that she did not belong in his house, and the part of her brain that managed practical details like footwear in February had simply gone offline. She went out the back door, across the yard, through the gate, past the garden, frozen and mulched for winter, the remnants of her mother's work, covered in straw. She walked down Cutter's Creek Road in the direction of nothing in particular, because she had nowhere to go, and hadn't yet understood that this was as serious as it was. The cold came up through her feet immediately, the road surface like a burn against bare skin, and she walked faster as if speed could outrun it. It was snowing before she reached the end of the road. Not gently, there was nothing gentle about February in Harlan County, but in the hard sideways way that meant a system moving through, not flurries. She turned north because she had some idea about getting to the highway, about maybe getting to Carla Renfro's house, about calling someone, about options. She had no clear plan. She had $43 and no shoes, and a baby the size of a walnut somewhere inside her, and a father who had decided she was no longer his. She walked for 40 minutes. She knew it was 40 minutes because she was counting. Counting was the only thing her mind would hold to. She counted steps, counted breaths, counted the spaces between the pain that was moving up her legs from the frozen road. The snow was deep enough to pull at her with each step. She was shaking so hard the backpack bounced against her spine with a violence that felt mechanical, like something coming apart. She thought, "I need to stop." She thought, "I cannot stop." She thought, "There is a light." She saw it through the pines on the east side of the ridge. Amber, warm, steady. A window with something burning inside it. It was far enough off the road that she almost dismissed it, But the road offered nothing in either direction, just white silence folding in on itself, and the light was there. She left the road and went through the pines. The snow in the trees was deeper than on the road, untracked, and she went down twice, once to her hip, once fully, face forward, and had to push herself up with hands that barely registered as belonging to her. She crawled the last 20 feet. She has said this many times in the years since, and people always seem surprised, as if they expect her to have a more dignified account. She crawled, hands and knees through the snow, backpack dragging, and the light in the window getting larger, and that was all she was. That was the whole of her in that moment, a body moving toward warmth. The cabin was small. She could see that much, even through the snow. A single-story structure, maybe 4 rooms, built from logs that had darkened with age into something the color of old wood and wet earth. There was smoke coming from the chimney. The window light was from oil. She could see the flicker of it, not the flat, steady light of electricity. There was a woodpile stacked on the porch, neat and serious, the stack of someone who had done this before and intended to do it again. There was a door. She got to her feet. She knocked. For 11 seconds she stood there and nothing happened, and the snow came down. Then the door opened, and the light that fell out of it was so warm and so complete that she flinched from it the way you flinch from sudden sound. The woman in the doorway was old. Nora's first impression was simply that old, in the way that suggests not just years, but accumulation, a person who has been many things over a long life and kept all of them. She was small, shorter than Nora, with white hair pulled back severely, and hands that were large and knotted and entirely still at her sides. She was wearing a heavy wool skirt and a flannel shirt and a cardigan that had been mended in at least 3 places with thread that didn't quite match. Her eyes were very dark and very alert, and they moved over Nora with the efficiency of someone assessing a situation quickly. She said nothing for 3 seconds. Then she stepped back from the door and said, "Come inside." That was it. No questions, no explanation requested. She simply stepped back and made room, and Nora came inside. The heat inside the cabin hit her like a wall. She stood just inside the doorway, and her body reacted to it in ways she couldn't control. The shaking intensified before it eased. Her hands began to hurt in the specific way that means they're coming back to life, and something in her chest cracked open, and she started crying in a way she hadn't cried since she was very small. Ugly, loud, the sound filling the small front room of the cabin, and she couldn't stop it and couldn't explain it and didn't try. The old woman guided her to a chair near the wood stove. She disappeared into another room. She came back with a blanket and a tin cup of broth, thin chicken broth, still steaming, and she put both of these things into Nora's hands without a word. She sat in a chair across from her, and she folded her own large knotted hands in her lap, and she waited. It took Nora approximately 6 minutes to stop crying, and another 4 to stop shaking. The broth helped, the blanket helped. The heat from the stove, which was sustained and serious, and radiated into the room with the steady reliability of something that had never been allowed to go out, helped most of all. When Nora could speak, she said, "I'm sorry." The old woman said, "Nothing to be sorry for." Nora said, "I don't know why I'm out here." The woman said, "Yes, you do." And something about the plainness of this, the refusal to be lied to gently, steadied Nora more than any comfort would have. The woman's name was Aura, just Aura. She offered no last name that night, and Nora didn't ask for one. She was, she said, 81 years old, and she had been living on this land since before Nora's parents were born, and she had no telephone, which was partly by choice and partly because the county had never run a line out this far, and she had never made enough noise about it for them to bother. She said this without bitterness. She said most things without bitterness, which Nora would come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of a very large and settled perspective. Nora stayed that night. That she meant to leave in the morning, to figure out a plan, to call someone, to do something with the problem of her life that she had not yet been able to name clearly. But in the morning, there was another 6 inches of snow, and Aura made eggs and biscuits and set them on the table and said, "You'll stay until it clears." This was not a question. Nora stayed. She stayed for 3 days while the storm moved through and the snow settled and the world outside the cabin, went very white and very quiet. In those 3 days, she helped with firewood and dishes and small repairs and learned to make something useful of herself in the specific economy of a life that depended on practical action. She told Aura about the baby on the second day, sitting at the table while Aura worked at something with a carved wooden tool that Nora didn't recognize. Aura said, "I suspected." Nora said, "My father threw me out." Aura said nothing for a long moment, and then she said, "Men do that sometimes, when they're more afraid than they can afford to admit. This is not an excuse, but it is a fact, and facts are useful." Nora turned this over in her mind for a long time. On the third day, when the snow had stopped and the path to the road was navigable, Aura said, "I have something to show you." She said it the way she said most things, plain, direct, with no performance around it, and led Nora to the back room of the cabin, the one Nora hadn't been into yet. It was small, and it smelled of cedar and dust, and it held a wooden trunk that Aura opened with a key she wore on a cord around her neck. Inside the trunk were letters. Dozens of them, bound with twine, some so old the paper had gone amber at the edges. There were photographs, formal ones, the kind made in studios, and informal ones taken in yards and on porches in the particular flat light of old photographs. There was a deed to the land, handwritten. There were 2 carved wooden birds, small enough to sit in a palm, made from a pale wood that caught the light. There was a name on the deed that Nora had heard before. Not often, and always in the particular way that certain names are mentioned in families. Briefly, quietly, with a closing off that tells you the name is attached to something that cannot be discussed easily. The name was Harmon, Margaret Harmon, née Gain. Nora looked up from the deed. Aura was watching her with her dark eyes and her still hands, and something in her expression that was not quite sorrow and not quite relief. She said, "Margaret Gaines was your grandmother's sister." She said, "This land has belonged to the Gaines family for 4 generations." She said, "Your father knows this land exists. He has always known." And there it was. The thing that couldn't be explained by the county maps or the 11 years of apparent emptiness. The thing that made the cabin impossible and yet entirely real. The thing that made Nora's survival not a random miracle, but something that looked, from a certain angle, like the land itself had kept a record that the people had tried to erase. The story Aura told over the next 2 hours was not simple. The simplest version of it is this. Margaret Harmon had been the eldest daughter of Nora's great-grandparents, and she had done something in 1951 that her family could not forgive. She had not done anything wicked. She had married a black man in a county where this was, if not illegal, then something close to impossible in practice, where the social consequences were total and immediate, and came with a completeness that required her family to choose between their daughter and their community. Her family had chosen their community. Margaret had been removed from the family record, the land she'd been promised had been reassigned, and her name had been said only in the specific way that names get said when they are being buried. Aura had known Margaret, had been for many decades Margaret's closest friend. She had come to this land after Margaret's death 15 years before, carrying the documents Margaret had kept, carrying the deed that said the land had never legally left Margaret's name and had passed, at her death, to her son. And she had come because Margaret had asked her to. Because Margaret had said, "Someone needs to be there when they find their way back. Someone needs to be a light in the window." Nora sat with this for a very long time. Outside, the snow was bright, and the sky had gone a particular shade of deep winter blue that is almost painful to look at. She was 16 years old, barefoot, until Aura had given her a pair of old wool socks and a pair of boots a size too large. She was pregnant. She had $43. She had a father who had sent her out into a February night, and a family that had once sent its own daughter out of memory entirely. She sat with all of this and let it settle. She said, "What was Margaret's son's name?" Aura said, Robert Harmon." She said, "Where is he now?" Aura said, "He's a doctor. He practices in Lexington. He's been looking for someone to give that deed to for about 8 years." The next chapter of Nora's life is long and specific and does not fit neatly into any category. She did not go home. She stayed with Aura for 6 weeks, helping with wood and water and the 1,000 small tasks of that particular life, eating simply, sleeping well, growing visibly rounder. Aura taught her things, how to read a weather pattern from cloud shape, how to mend a seam so it held, how to make something last by using it correctly. These were not lessons Nora had asked for. Aura simply did things in her presence and left space for observation. And Nora was the kind of person who watched closely and learned without being taught. She contacted Robert Harmon by letter because there was no phone. He wrote back within the week. He said, "I'll come in the spring." Before spring, she needed somewhere to go. She was, eventually, found, not by her father, but by her school's attendance officer, and through that contact, the county's child welfare system, which placed her temporarily in the care of a woman named Betty Sizemore, who ran a licensed foster home in Cumberland, and who was, it must be said, not a warm person, but was an honest one who kept the house clean and the pantry stocked, and asked no more than was reasonable. Nora was there for 2 months. She went to school on the county bus, 8 months pregnant and stoic in the face of everything. The hallways of a small county high school offered a pregnant 16-year-old. She kept her head down. She did her homework. She did not speak to Cody Whitaker, who she passed twice in the main corridor and who both times found something of great interest to examine on his phone. Her daughter was born on July 14, 2003, at Harlan ARH Hospital at 6:42 in the morning, in a room where the only person present was a labor and delivery nurse named Tammy, who had seen everything and whose presence was enough. Nora was the only person in the room who mattered, and she knew this, and she held on to it. The baby was 7 pounds, 2 ounces, entirely healthy, with the particular look of newborns, ancient and furious and utterly themselves. Nora held her and understood, with the totality that some moments arrive in, that she would not be giving her up, that whatever happened next, it would happen with this child. She named her Margaret. She called her Maggie from the first day and would never call her anything else, but the name on the certificate was Margaret Aura Gaines, and both women for whom the name was intended were told, and both wept, though in different ways and for different reasons. What came next was 8 years of the kind of living that doesn't make for clean storytelling. It was working and studying and childcare arrangements that fell through and working more and moving twice, and the particular brand of exhaustion that is not just physical but existential. The exhaustion of being young and alone and responsible for something irreplaceable. It was community college at nights while Maggie stayed with Betty Sizemore, who had no warmth but had kept the door open, and who watched Maggie with the competence, if not the tenderness, of someone who knew how to keep a child safe, if not exactly joyful. It was $14,000 in student debt accumulated across 4 years of part-time enrollment. It was Nora's GPA, 3.8, achieved in the spaces between shifts at the grocery store, then the hospital cafeteria, then the hospital itself when she got her CNA certification, and then her RN, working nights and sleeping in the in-between hours in a way that left her with a relationship to sleep she would describe as complicated for the rest of her life. It was Maggie growing, from the ancient furious newborn into a toddler who had her grandmother Patricia's dark hair and her mother's still watching quality, and then into a child who was curious about everything and afraid of almost nothing, which was both a challenge and a gift. Robert Harmon drove to Harlan County in April of 2004 when Nora was at Betty Sizemore's house and Maggie was 8 months old and the county was beginning to tilt towards spring in the tentative way it did, the red buds coming out on the hillsides in small bursts of improbable purple. He was 63 years old, and he had the bearing of someone who has spent decades being the only person like himself in rooms full of people who needed him to be exceptional, which he was, though it had cost him something. He sat at Betty Sizemore's kitchen table, and he put the deed on the table between them, and he said, "This land belongs to the family. It always did. It should have been acknowledged decades ago. I'm not interested in money. I'm interested in the record being correct." Nora looked at the deed for a long time. She looked at the name. She said, "What do I do with this?" Robert said, "Whatever you think is right." Then he said, "Your grandmother Margaret would have liked you. She was exactly this stubborn." He said this with something in his face that was not quite a smile, but was close enough that Nora felt it land in the same place. The legal process of correcting the land record took 2.5 years and cost $4,800 in attorney's fees that Robert paid without discussion, stating only that it was the least of what was owed. The county records office was not hostile exactly, but was not quick. There were documents to locate and affidavits to file, and a judge in Harlan who reviewed the case with the careful neutrality of someone who understood exactly what it meant, but had no interest in saying so out loud. On a Tuesday morning in November of 2006, the record was corrected. The land on the back side of Craddock Ridge, 340 acres of timber and rock, and one small log cabin with an oil lamp in the window, was recorded as belonging to the estate of Margaret Harmon, and from that estate to her heirs, which meant, in the specific legal language that the judge's signature made real, that it now belonged to Robert, which meant, by Robert's own transfer executed in the same session, that it belonged to Nora. She drove out there that afternoon. Maggie was 3.5 and asleep in the back seat, her head tipped sideways against the car seat in the way that children sleep, total and uncomplicated. Nora parked where the road ended and sat for a moment looking through the pines toward the cabin. The amber light was in the window. Aura was still there. She would be there for another 4 years, until she was 89, and her body made clear that the land could not carry her anymore. And then she would move to a facility in Harrogate, with the stoic practicality she brought to everything, having made Nora promise to plant a kitchen garden in the spring. Nora made the promise. She kept it. She carried Maggie through the pines, the girl stirring and waking, and looking around with the interested calm of someone for whom the world is still entirely comprehensible. Nora held her against her chest, Maggie's weight warm and real against her collarbone, and she walked toward the cabin and the light. She was 19 years old. She owned 340 acres of Harlan County. She had an RN degree in progress and $7,200 in a savings account, and a daughter named after 2 women she had met in the worst night of her life. She had none of the things she'd had when she was 15, and the world was green shutters and a fern, and Biscuit asleep in the afternoon sun. She had other things instead. They were different, and they were hers, and they had been earned in a way that the green shutters and the fern had never needed to be. This is the part of the story where a simpler kind of narrator might suggest that Nora was done, that she had her land and her daughter and her education, and the record had been corrected, and so the account was settled. But Nora was not done, because she had a mother she hadn't spoken to in 3 years, and a father she hadn't spoken to in longer. And Maggie was growing into a person who asked questions the way curious children do, without mercy, without the social instinct for which questions are allowable. By the time Maggie was 7, the question had arrived, "How come I've never met your parents?" And Nora, who had learned from Aura that facts are useful and that the gap between what people say and what they mean is where most of the damage happens, had no answer she was willing to give a 7-year-old, which meant she was not ready yet. She had more preparation to do. It was a different question, 3 years later, that finally moved her. Maggie was 10 years old, serious and watchful, and given to statements that arrived with the clarity of someone who hasn't yet learned to soften truth for the comfort of the listener. They were sitting at the kitchen table in the small house Nora was renting in Corbin while she finished her last year of nursing school. And Maggie was doing homework and Nora was reviewing drug interaction charts. And Maggie looked up and said, without any preamble at all, "Mom, are you still angry at them?" Nora said, "Who?" Maggie said, "Your parents. Are you still angry at them or are you just scared?" 7 seconds of silence. Nora counted, the way she had been counting since she was 16 years old, and her father stood in her doorway and made a decision. She said, "I think I might be both." Maggie nodded and went back to her homework, as if this was the answer she had expected, as if, now that it was named, something could happen with it. The call was made the following week, not to her father. She was not ready for her father, and she was honest with herself about this, because she had learned from years of hard living that false readiness costs more than the time spent waiting for real readiness. She called her mother. Patricia answered on the second ring. When she heard Nora's voice, she made a sound that was not a word, that was just sound. The sound of something that has been held for 10 years, coming loose in a single exhalation. Nora held the phone and listened to this and did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, I have a daughter. I want you to meet her." And Patricia said, Oh, Nora, I've been waiting. I've been waiting for you to call." The story of what had happened in that house during those 10 years is not simple. and Patricia told it over several phone calls in the weeks that followed, in pieces, the way stories that have been compressed under great pressure come out, not smoothly, but in bursts, unevenly, with silences between that held as much as the words. Gerald had not softened immediately. He had been, Patricia said, unbearable for the first year, rigid and silent in the way that some men are rigid and silent when they have done something they cannot name as wrong, because naming it as wrong would require them to become someone different than who they had decided to be. He had forbidden Patricia to contact Nora. She had not obeyed this. She had sent letters to Betty Sizemore's address, which she had gotten from the school, and received no response because the letters had arrived after Nora left. She had sent 3 more to an address she'd gotten from a friend at the county health department, and those letters she believed had arrived, though she'd never been certain. What happened to Gerald was not a dramatic conversion. It was a slow erosion. Danny, their son, told his father when he was 22 that he was gay, and Gerald's response to this cost him his relationship with Danny for 4 years. During those 4 years, Gerald Gaines sat in the house on Cutters Creek Road with the green shutters and the aging Fern and Biscuit, who had finally died at 15 and been replaced by a dog named Cracker, who had none of Biscuit's dignity, and he sat with the fact that he had now driven 2 of his children away from his house, with his particular combination of love and rigidity and fear. The 3rd child, Shannon, had married a man Gerald liked well enough and lived 40 minutes away and visited on holidays and maintained the careful neutrality of a person navigating between people who cannot yet speak to each other directly. Gerald sat with the accounting of this for a long time. He was not a man who changed easily or quickly, but he was not at bottom a man without conscience. The conscience had been overpowered for a long time by the pride. Eventually, the conscience won. It was a slow, undramatic, painful process that left marks, and it did not undo what had been done, but it was real. By the time Patricia called him into the kitchen one evening in October of 2013 and said, "Nora is coming next Sunday. I need you to be ready," Gerald was ready. Or as ready as a man like Gerald could be for the thing he had earned and could not avoid. Nora drove to Harlan County on a Sunday in late October, with Maggie in the passenger seat, 13 years old now, and composed with the composure of someone who has decided to be brave. The mountains were in full color, the deep orange and yellow of Appalachian fall, the kind of color that people from flat places drive 6 hours to look at and still feel they haven't quite seen enough. Nora had not been back to Harlan County since the legal proceedings in 2006. The county had the same mountains, obviously, the same sky. The stoplight on 421 was still the only stoplight she could remember. The dollar store had replaced the hardware store. The Dairy Queen was still there. She drove past it without looking at it. The house on Cutters Creek Road looked smaller than she remembered, which was not surprising. The shutters were green, freshly painted. Gerald's biannual project still ongoing. The fern was on the porch, which she had not expected, and its presence did something complicated to her chest. The same fern, or a descendant of it, survivor of God knows how many winters. Patricia was on the porch before Nora had the engine off, and she crossed the yard with the speed of someone who has been waiting and is done waiting, and she put her arms around Nora before either of them had said a word. Nora stood in her mother's arms and felt, not relief exactly, not the simple download of 10 years of longing, something more complex than that, something like, this is real, this is still real. Maggie got out of the car and stood by it with her watching patience, and Patricia looked at her over Nora's shoulder and made another sound that had no words in it. She said, "Come here, baby," and Maggie came, and Patricia held them both, and that was the first real thing that happened on Cutters Creek Road on that October Sunday. Gerald was inside. Nora knew he was inside, and he knew she was outside, and both of them took a moment before the moment could happen. Patricia brought them into the kitchen that smelled exactly the way Nora remembered, which was cornbread and wood smoke and the specific olfactory signature of a house that has been lived in by the same people for 30 years. And Gerald was standing by the window with his coffee, and he turned when they came in. He was older. She had prepared herself for this and was still not entirely prepared. He had more gray than dark now, and he moved with the careful consideration of a man whose joints had begun requiring thought. He looked at Nora with the same combination of emotions she'd seen on his face in the doorway 17 years ago, but transformed. Not rage and shame and fear wound together, something more like grief and resolution, the aftermath of a storm rather than the storm itself. He said, "Nora." She said, "Dad." He said, "I am sorry." He said it plainly, not with performance or drama, in the way that men who have taken a long time to get somewhere say the thing they've finally arrived at, simply because they have had long enough to find the actual words and have no need to dress them up. He said, "I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong, and I chose the wrong thing anyway, and I have had 17 years to think about it, and there's not a day I didn't." He said, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm just telling you the truth, so you have all of it." Nora stood in the kitchen that smelled like her childhood and looked at her father and said nothing for several seconds. She said, "I know, Dad. I believe you." She said, "I'm not there yet, on the forgiveness. I want to be honest with you about that the way you were just honest with me." Gerald nodded. He looked at Maggie, who was watching this exchange with the attentiveness of someone who understands she is witnessing something important and is cataloging it. He said, "You must be Margaret." Maggie said, "Maggie." He said, "Maggie." Then, to Nora, "She looks like your grandmother." And Nora said, "I know, she knows, she's been told." They sat at the kitchen table. Patricia made coffee and put out food, and the conversation was careful at first, the way conversations are careful when people are navigating something large and fragile simultaneously. And then, gradually, with the patience that the afternoon allowed, it became easier. Not easy, but easier. Maggie asked questions, direct, clear questions that landed in the conversation the way children's questions do, too honest to be deflected, and the adults answered them, sometimes with more truth than they had intended. And the afternoon moved through the light of a Harlan County October, the kitchen getting warmer, the food getting eaten, the space between them getting incrementally smaller. Before they left, Gerald took Nora out to the porch. He showed her the fern. He said, "Your mother wouldn't let me throw it out. I wanted to, the first winter, because it was yours." He said, "She was right not to let me. I've been wrong about a lot of things, and she's been right about most of them, which I'm sure will come as no surprise to you." Nora laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, the sound of it, genuine and involuntary, her screen door laugh, unchanged. Gerald looked at her when she laughed, and something in his face changed. Something moved through it, not joy, something more like recognition, something like, "There you are." She came back the following month, and the month after that. Not every Sunday, not with the regularity that some stories of reconciliation portray as natural, but with increasing frequency, with the understanding that regularity takes time to build, and that time, while not free, was still available. Maggie formed a relationship with Patricia that was immediate and uncomplicated. The ease between a grandmother and grandchild who have found each other late and are not going to waste the finding. With Gerald, it was slower. He was not a man who warmed quickly, and Maggie did not push. She simply made herself present and allowed him to come to her at the pace he could manage, which took about 4 months and then arrived all at once, when he showed her how to repoint the shutters in the spring, and she held the brush the wrong way, and he corrected her grip with a patience that was new for him, or rather a patience that had always been in him and had been covered for a long time by things he chose over it. Danny came back. That is a whole other story with its own weight and its own time, but he came back, and Gerald met Daniel's husband at Thanksgiving, 2 years after Nora's first Sunday on Cutters Creek Road, and Gerald shook his hand and said, "Thank you for coming." It was not warmth, exactly, but it was the specific and meaningful absence of rejection, which in Gerald Gaines's emotional vocabulary was a significant offering, and Daniel understood it as such. The land on the backside of Craddock Ridge remained Nora's. She had plans for it. She'd had plans for years, the kind of plans that get made in the small hours of night shifts when the mind ranges toward the future. She built a second structure on the property in 2017, a small house, modest and well-made, with a porch on the east side that caught the morning sun. She moved there when Maggie started college in Lexington, nursing, like her mother, with the same focused intensity and none of Nora's original exhaustion, because Maggie had the things Nora had not had, which was time and support, and a mother who had paid in advance. The cabin remained standing. Nora had it repaired and rechinked and kept the oil lamp in the window, lit in the evenings, because some habits are worth keeping for what they mean rather than what they do. Ora died in the spring of 2019 at 97 years old in the care facility in Harrogate, in a room that Nora had made sure had good light and a window with a view of trees. Nora was with her at the end. They didn't talk much. Ora had stopped talking much in her final weeks, preferring to conserve the energy for breathing and for occasionally squeezing the hand of whoever was sitting with her. Nora sat with her for the last afternoon and held her hand and looked out the window at the trees. Just before dark, Ora said, "You planted the garden." Not a question. Nora said, "3 years ago. Good kitchen garden." Ora said, "Good." And then she was quiet, and a little while after that she was gone, and Nora sat with her hand a little longer before she let go. The carved wooden birds from the trunk were on Nora's mantel now, both of them. She'd asked Robert Harmon if he wanted one, and he'd said, "No, they belong with the land." She understood what he meant. They were Margaret's hands, her craft, her specific record of herself, and they belonged in the place that was hers. Robert Harmon died in 2021, having practiced medicine for 37 years, having quietly paid for the education of 4 young people from Harlan County who couldn't otherwise have managed it, having given 1 deed to 1 girl at 1 kitchen table and changed more things than he knew. Nora spoke at his funeral. She said what was true and did not embellish it. She said, "He understood that the record matters. He understood that getting the record right is not a small thing." Maggie graduated from nursing school in 2023. She is working now at the University of Kentucky Hospital in Lexington Pediatric Ward because she has her mother's instinct for exactly how to be useful at the moment when someone most needs someone to be useful, and because she is drawn to children in the specific way of people who were loved well and want to pay it forward. She visits Craddock Ridge on weekends when she can. She helps in the garden, which has become genuinely good now, the kind of garden that knows what it's doing, that has been kept long enough to develop its own character and abundance. She sits with her grandfather on the porch of the house on Cutters Creek Road when the weather allows, and she has learned to value those long, almost wordless afternoons the way Nora has learned to value them, not as the thing they might have been if they had happened earlier, but as the thing they are, right now, in the time that is still available. Nora is 37 years old. She is charge nurse on the night shift at Harlan ARH, the same hospital where Maggie was born, which is one of the gentler ironies of a life that has contained many of them. She drives 22 minutes to work down roads she has known her whole life, through mountains that are older than any of this and will outlast all of it. She has a kitchen garden and a lit window, and a daughter who is extraordinary, and 2 carved birds on her mantel, and a father she is not quite forgiven and loves anyway, because Ora was right that these things are not the same and do not have to be. She has her land. She has the record corrected. She has more than the girl crawling through February snow toward an impossible light had any reason to expect. Forgiveness, as it turns out, is not an event. You will hear it described that way. The moment of forgiveness, the choice to forgive, the clean, bright line between before and after. But Nora would tell you, and has told her daughter, and would tell you if you asked her, that forgiveness is a practice, that you choose it again and again, in small moments, in the space between what you feel and what you decide to do with what you feel. That some days it is closer, and some days it is far, and that this is not failure. That carrying the weight of what was done to you and still choosing to build something is not weakness or capitulation or the erasure of the wrong. It is the most difficult and most necessary thing. It costs something real, and it is worth it. Not because those who wronged you deserve it, but because you do. If you are watching this, and you know what it is to be pushed out into the cold by someone who was supposed to keep you warm, if you know what it is to crawl toward a light you can barely see and trust it against all available evidence because you have no other choice, then I want you to hear this. The cabin is there. The light is real. And the woman who opens the door and steps back without asking any questions, she exists. You will find her. You will crawl to her through the worst of it, and she will put something warm in your hands, and she will wait without judgment for you to stop shaking. And one day, years from now, you will plant a garden in ground that is yours. You will light a lamp in your own window. And when someone stumbles toward it out of the dark, you will step back and make room, because that is how it works. That is how it has always worked. Not perfectly, not without scars, but without end.